Great.
All right. So, hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar with a distinguished guest who I will introduce later. Now, the webinar, this webinar is titled November 21st Elections in Venezuela, One More Sign of Bolivarian Democracy. We have a very distinguished and well-informed speaker from Venezuela, whom I will introduce, as I said, shortly. First of all, let me remind everyone that this webinar will be live streamed on Facebook, and I will put in the chat the link to the live stream Facebook. So please share it if you have a chance to go there and share with all your friends and groups. So my name is Nino Paglicia. I am an activist and writer, and I will be the host of this webinar. For full disclosure, I am a Venezuelan Canadian. Now, this is the program for tonight. We have some acknowledgements. We'll have a short introduction to the webinar and the speaker. We'll have our guest speaker to address the topic of this webinar, and we will end with Q&A. Now, here, let me remind you, please, if you have questions that you want answered, please click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your Zoom window. A small window will pop up and you will be able to type in your question. If you put in your question in the chat window, I will not be able to see it. And so do the Q&A window question. All right, so let me start. First of all, I want to acknowledge that I am standing on indigenous land. I am grateful to all First Nations for accepting me as a guest on the territory where I stand, and as an ally in the struggle for the just demands. I salute you and thank you. Now, this webinar has been organized by the member organizations of the Venezuela Peace and Solidarity Committee of Vancouver. Now, it is my pleasure to ask our co-host, Barbara Walden, to introduce the Venezuela Peace and Solidarity Committee of Vancouver and the member organizations. Barbara, please go ahead.
Thank you, Nino. Yeah, we got started on January 31st, 2019. This was a moment of crisis for Venezuela under attack by US-led imperialism, with a misinformation campaign, a campaign of interference, and a coup attempt by towards the end of February, I think February 20th. So the organizations that take part in this committee met. They were the Hugo Chavez Front for the Defense of the People, Southwest BC, and the Vancouver Peace Council, the Communist Party of Canada, the BC region, Marxist-Leninist Party of Canada, BC region, the International League of People's Struggles Vancouver area organizations, which includes my organization and a few others. My organization is the Just Peace Committee. So I'll read you a little bit of our perspective. So we are anti-imperialist. Imperialism is in all-sided crisis worldwide. The US itself is in acute crisis politically, socially, culturally, economically, and medically. With the fundamentals of the US Republican model and liberal democracy under attack on the inside, and US social health and justice systems revealing the failures of neoliberalism that create mass suffering, US-led imperialism has been building its military machinery and extending its relations with reaction and fascism abroad so as to intensify the attacks on socialism, independence, and democracy. Bolivarian Venezuela is one of its key targets. And the Biden administration is continuing on the same destructive and ruthless path. So since January 2019, our committee has worked to do its part in building a united international people's response in solidarity with all the oppressed and the victims of imperialist economic and military aggression. We endeavor to build solidarity with the people of Venezuela to protect the democracy and all the benefits of the Bolivarian project in Venezuela, to end the economic coercive measures and prevent all-out war in the region. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Barbara. Yes, we are really happy to be able to organize this webinar, and we start thanking all our attendees and participants. But now it's my pleasure. First of all, I would like to mention again the endorsers of this event, the Canadian-Cuba Friendship Association of Vancouver. I'm a member of this association, and the International League of People's Struggle Canada-wide. Next, it's my pleasure to introduce our media sponsor. I want to acknowledge and thank the Canada Files and its editor, Aidan Jonah, for sponsoring this event. So we should never lose track of imperialism, imperialist Canadian foreign policy, especially as we have seen towards Venezuela. So it is my pleasure to invite Aidan to speak. Aidan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So the Canada Files is very pleased to be the media sponsor for today's terrific event, featuring good friend of the Canada Files, Jesús Rodriguez Espinoza, editor of Orinoco Tribune. From the Canada Files founding in November 2019, we have been proud to stand firmly in solidarity with Venezuela's Bolivarian Revolution, where we are a socialist anti-imperialist news outlet which focuses on investigations and analysis of Canadian foreign policy. Canada's role in attempting to crush the Bolivarian Revolution has been a consistent one. It was in support of the American-backed 2002 coup attempt against Hugo Chavez. For more than a decade, Canada's embassy in Venezuela has provided funding for opposition activists through an annual human rights award. Then in 2017, Canada was the driving force behind the creation of the Lima Group. As Orinoco Tribune contributor Steve Lala put it for the Canada Files, the Lima Group is a Canada-led organization dedicated to the ouster of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. Canada and the Lima Group supported both diplomatically and publicly fake President Juan Guaido's attempted coup in 2019, being only one of a few countries to recognize Guaido as Venezuela's supposed president. Obviously, with the election of Castillo, the Lima Group has effectively collapsed, and that is something to cheer on, but we cannot count it to be dead until it really is declared openly. Now, with elections set to occur in Venezuela, The Canadian imperialist government is almost certain to use this process as a chance to demonize the Bolivarian Revolution yet again. This is why solidarity with Venezuela and taking clear action to mobilize support against Western sanctions on Venezuela is so important. I'd strongly urge you to support Orinoco's Tribune's work financially if possible, and if there's resources to spare afterwards, to also consider supporting the Canada Files financially. I'm very much looking forward to hearing Jesús's presentation on the upcoming election. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you so much, Aidan. I really appreciate your introduction. I'm a fan of the Canada Files and also of the Orinoco Tribune, of course. And I find it quite meaningful that we have the Canada File that deals with Canadian foreign policy, which involves Venezuela very much. And then we have the Orinoco Tribune that informs us about what's happening from the other end, which is Venezuela, and also other regions of the world. So that's sort of the perfect combination in my view. But let me now introduce the webinar. And before we hear Jesús. As I mentioned before, the topic that we will hear about in a moment is the upcoming regional elections to take place in Venezuela on November 21st. The byline of the title says, "One more sign of Bolivarian democracy." This will be the 29th call to Venezuelans to cast a vote in 22 years of Chavismo. We believe that there must be a link between the electoral process as part of the decision-making process that people use to express their political choices and the notion of democracy with capital D. Nowhere the word democracy implies only participation in elections, nor dominance by corporation or embedded media. But this seems to be the model of democracy that is promoted, indeed forced, by the so-called Western ideology. For a good reason, because of that model has worked really well in imposing and maintaining neoliberal policies at a very high cost for the working class, the 99%. Venezuela begs to be different and has embarked in developing its own model of, and I quote, democratic, participatory, and protagonist society, as it is stated in the Venezuelan Constitution, based on its right to sovereignty and self-determination. However, Venezuela is accused of being a dictatorship with 29 elections and about 40 political parties participating or trying to. Venezuela is accused of fraudulent elections. We might hear today, if this is even possible, Venezuela is accused of not following the rule of law. Canada, among others, intervenes to promote a peaceful return to democracy according to Canadian values. Okay, now let's see what Canadian democracy looks like. In Canada, we have an unelected head of state, the Governor General, who represents a foreign power, the Queen of England. The Governor General is appointed by the Prime Minister of Canada, who is the head of the government. Then we have a Senate, the higher chamber of Parliament, with 105 members who are not elected. They are appointed by the unelected Governor General on the advice of the Prime Minister, who appointed the Governor General to start with. The model of democracy in Canada is based on the so-called Constitutional Convention. That is a constitutional convention is an informal agreement rather than a formal written constitution. Now, to be fair, Canada does have a constitution written in 1867, but a lot is still run by the unwritten convention. Now, then we have the case of the United Kingdom, which does not even have a constitutional document. And in the case of the United States, the president and vice president are not elected directly by the people. Instead, voters cast a ballot to elect the real electors from a group of about 540 individuals of the so-called Electoral College, who actually choose the president and vice president of the United States. Okay, having said that, this is not the venue to suggest that this country should change the model of elite democracy, as Chavez called them. Nor are we aware that Venezuela is making such demands. That is the task of their own citizens to do on their own accord. But this is the venue where those countries rooted in colonialism and imperialism should stop dictating to Venezuelans how to run the society and should stop imposing illegal coercive measures to force a regime change in Venezuela and causing indescribable suffering and deaths. Now, let's keep this in mind as we hear our speaker, Jesús Rodriguez Espinoza, speak about a specific instance of the Venezuelan democratic process, the mega elections of November 21st. So now it's my pleasure, my full pleasure, to introduce a respectful journalist and diplomat, Jesús Rodriguez Espinoza. Jesús is an expert in international relations, Venezuelan politics, and communication. He served for several years as Consul General of Venezuela in Chicago, United States. And prior to that, he was part of the foundational editorial team of the website aporrea.org. He is the founder and editor of the Venezuelan socialist website Orinoco Tribune. The Orinoco Tribune has been online less than 3 years, and in those 3 years has grown to be a prominent source of information on Venezuela and international news and analysis directly from Venezuela. As an activist and writer, the Orinoco Tribune is my go-to for my research. So Jesús, welcome. You have the floor.
Thank you, Nino. And thank you to all of you guys in Vancouver and in Canada that are in solidarity with Venezuela and with the countries that oppose US imperialism. I'm just happy to be here today. We have been having a lot of rain in Caracas in recent days, so maybe we might have a bumpy internet. I'm not expecting that, but I'm saying that just in case. But in any case, I prepare a slideshow because I don't like to use a slideshow too much, but sometimes when I have a lot of information that I want to share, I prefer to use it to not miss anything, to avoid missing something. So what I'm going to do right now is to share my screen with you and start with the slideshow, which is basically I'm going to dedicate an important part of my talking today to the something that I believe that is important because mass media, mainstream media has been pushing it that much that I believe is in the head of many people, not only in Venezuela, but around the world, which is the fact that we don't have fair elections in Venezuela. So that's why I'm going to dedicate the first part of my talk today to try to show you how hard it is or should be for journalists and to spread that lie about the Venezuelan electoral system. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen. I hope you can see it now. So I'm going to start. This is the index. At the end of my speech, I'm going to share the link to the slideshow with you. So this is basically what I'm planning to talk to you today. So at the beginning, I want you to see. This is a statement from Jimmy Carter in 2012. Maybe you are not listening to it. It's a shame, but anyway, I'm gonna share it with you. Basically, what the video said is what was right in there, that Venezuelan electoral system is the best in the world. That was said by Jimmy Carter in 2012. And this next one is from the head of the SILA, which is the Latin American Committee of Electoral Experts, which has been in Venezuelan elections for several years in several occasions, and they say that Venezuelan electoral system is the best in Latin America. And the guy in the video said that he doesn't say in the world because they have not monitored elections outside Latin America, but that he believes that is among the best electoral systems in the world. So I don't want to read it because you have it in front of you, but and I don't want to put you the video because it's kind of long. And I'm going to jump to the European Union. Some part of the report of the European Union in the last electoral observation that they had in Venezuela. And as you can read there, they basically say that the electoral process complied with international standards and national legislation. So they didn't have anything to complain about the Venezuelan electoral system. And that is something to recognize, especially the European Union never has been sympathetic to Chavismo. At that time in 2002, Hugo Chavez was in power. And since Hugo Chavez took power, the European Union has been very hostile towards Venezuela. So that coming from the European Union is something like important to, to show. And now I'm going to jump to, I want to talk a little bit about transparency and audits in the Venezuelan elections. I have to say that in the CNE, I mean, the National Electoral Council, which is the electoral authority in Venezuela, have designed certain audits to the electoral process in Venezuela. In all those audits, international observers, witnesses, and representatives of political parties, local political parties, I mean, are present. And also, in recent years, I believe that for the last 3 or 4 years, most of those audits are streamed online, and you can see them in the CNE TV, which is a channel that they create for people to watch the audits. So just to give you an idea of what we are talking here in Venezuela about transparency and audits and democracy, you know, at the end of the day. One thing that I want to highlight before jumping to the audits is the fact that we in Venezuela are very committed to the principle of one person, one vote. That doesn't happen in many countries. And sometimes we Venezuelans take it for granted and we don't make it clear outside our boundaries, I mean, abroad. And I believe that that's very important. What that means, one person, one vote, that in Venezuela is impossible for one person to vote more than one time. And it might be for some of you something that is obvious, but the reality is that in many countries around the world, not only in Latin America, I can actually talk a little bit about the recent US presidential elections, but I don't want to divert towards that direction. But in many countries, people vote more than once. And we have designed since 2004, I believe, or 2003, a system in which every voter, before going to the ballot box, is fingerprint scanned in order to verify that that voter did not vote in other places. So that guarantees that principle of one person, one vote, which I believe is incredibly important, you know, to show how transparent our elections are. And we have since President Chavez took office, several international companions, we call it in recent years, which is kind of different to international observers, but is pretty similar, I mean. So, so in all our elections, we have international observers, international delegations watching the whole process. I wrote something like a tip there. Okay, I talk about the tip I mentioned. I already talked about what is in the tip there. So I'm gonna jump to the next part. It's a continuation of what I was talking about. And I wanted to highlight these things that sometimes also are taken for granted. I mean, documentation. In a lot of countries, people do not have ID cards. And just for that tiny reason, they cannot exercise their right to vote. In Venezuela, since Hugo Chavez, because before Hugo Chavez, that was not a priority for previous right-wing governments before Hugo Chavez. Since Hugo Chavez took office, there was a massive campaign of issuing national IDs to Venezuelans, and not only to Venezuelans, even to foreigners. We have a humongous Colombian colony in Venezuela, and they were the most benefited by this campaign of providing IDs. And that is something that make it really accessible, the right to vote. And every election, before every election, we have these campaigns from the CNE, from our electoral authority, to promote people to get their IDs. So the CNE always before elections, they initiate campaigns to make it easy for Venezuelans that want to have their IDs because they are expired or they didn't have one before or they got robbed or something like that. They have these campaigns to allow and facilitate people to have their IDs. The electoral roll is something very important that is sometimes forgetting when people are talking about elections in Venezuela. The electoral roll in Venezuela was something that no one knew exactly what it was until a few years ago. I'm talking about, I believe that it actually started formally since 2008 or 2009 when the CNE, I mean, the electoral authority took the responsibility of handling the civil registry. I mean, every Venezuelan that is born is registered right now within the database of the CNE. And if you die, you have to fill the information within the CNE database. And that is something incredibly amazing because one of the biggest problems that our electoral roll has was that there were a lot of dead people that sometimes were used by, especially, I mean, I'm talking about the time before Chavez, by the political parties to make dead people vote. That's a reality. That's something that happened. So that's why I'm telling you that right now that's almost impossible because I mean there's a correlation between the civil registry, the national civil registry, and the national electoral registry, and that's very important for the consistency of the electoral roll. So that's something very important to highlight in my opinion. The voting centers district re-engineering. What that means? That means that before Hugo Chavez took power, most of the electoral voting centers, I mean, were located in wealthy neighborhoods, middle-class neighborhoods. Not too many were in poor areas because the idea was to get the votes of the people with means and not the poor people. When Hugo Chavez took office, and that has been continuing being like that, the whole, districting and mapping of the voting centers changed. And in order to facilitate the vote for those ones that live in poor barrios, in poor neighborhoods in Venezuela, and that's also another important issue that sometimes we don't talk too much about, but it's important to highlight. So voting on Sundays, some people might believe that that's stupid, but voting on Sundays is something that is being discussed in many countries, like in the US, for example, that they decide to have elections on a Wednesday, for example, when everyone is at work, making it hard for people to go to vote. And that is something that has been happening in Venezuela forever, but I just wanted to share that with you because that's also another element that is relevant to talk about, if a government or if a state is trying to really encourage voting. Another thing that is important also in this area is mock elections. In recent years, the CNE have developed a very accurate and important system of making mock elections a few weeks before any presidential, regional, parliamentary elections. And that's very important because people first get used to the electoral, offer, as we call it. I mean, of the candidates, they get used to the panel, to the voting machine, and how the parties and the candidates are displaying in the machines. But it is also an opportunity to polish the electoral electoral machine and to see if there are mistakes or flaws. And also it's an important also element for political parties to, to train their people, their witnesses and everything in order to, be in better shape for the real elections. And we actually had that mock elections a few days ago on October 10th here in Venezuela. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about the 13 audits. I don't wanna talk a lot talking about them because I put the source to this information in the slideshow that I'm gonna share with you at the end of my talk. But basically we have like 10 pre-election audits. There's an audit for voting software. There's another audit called voting machine files audit, voters data audit, voting machine production audit, electoral infrastructure audit, pre-deployment audit, totaling software audit, reset to zero audit, telecom audit, citizen verification audit, and after the election we have the telecom audit part 2, the citizen verification audit part 2, and the voters data audit part 2. Those are like the certain audits that are part of the electoral, design Venezuela. And all those audits you have representatives of each political party, and most of the time you also have international and local observers, because it's important to highlight that we not only have international electoral observers, but also local electoral observers. Sorry, what you have there is what we call in Venezuela the electoral horseshoe, is basically the voting process, and all Venezuelans are familiarized with that. And I wanted to show it to you to have an idea of how it works. In the step 1, you can see that the voter presents his ID, then he has his fingerprint scanned in that first part, and then after the fingerprint scan, he is allowed to go to the voting machine. And then after voting, the voting machine provides him with a receipt that is put in a box. The receipt is just for audit purposes, because the real information is in the machine, and at the end of the voting process, it is transmitted to the CNE headquarters, and from dropping your voting receipt in the ballot box, you go to another station in which you put your fingerprints. It's like a notebook where your data is. There's your name, your ID number, national ID numbers, and you have to sign it and put your fingerprints as a sign that you actually voted. And then this last one, the number 5, is not being used. I believe that for the last 3 or 4 years because of the economic crisis and the US sanctions, because there are not enough resources to pay for this that is called the ink. The indelible ink it was like an ink that people before we use the fingerprint scanning, Venezuelans were used to supposedly to use that ink to avoid people voting twice, which is something that really did not help too much, because voting twice was the rule in Venezuela before Hugo Chavez. So that's, I wanted to show you that to give you an idea of how hard it is to trick the electoral process in Venezuela. And with this last one slide showed, I also wanted to, I'm just trying, you have like 4 steps. Starting with the biometric fingerprint scan. And then, I mean, this is like the electoral process. No, when you vote in Venezuela, you do what I mentioned you already. And one of the most important steps there is the biometric finger scan. Then you, of course, do your voting. And then at the end of the voting process in the electoral center, and within electoral centers in Venezuela, we have something that we call electoral desk or tables, which are the minimal expression of the voting places in Venezuela. So after everyone already voted and the electoral center is closed, the citizen scrutiny opens, and everyone, not only witnesses from political parties and members of the electoral center, the voting center, but also citizens are allowed to watch the transmission, electronically transmission of the votes, but also the counting, that audit of counting the receipts that are in the boxes. And that is amazing because the machine will give you a result of how many votes and who vote for whom at that level. But you also will have, at that moment, you will verify that electronic result with what is in the box. So it is almost impossible. And if something is wrong for some reason, everything is put on the memo, I don't know how you say that in English, and el acta. I forgot the word in English, but electoral memo or whatever, I'm not sure. So basically, and a few hours later, after the citizen scrutiny happened, you will be able, any Venezuelan will be able to see the results of the elections, not like in general. I mean, voting center by voting center and voting desk, as I mentioned, that is the minimal expression of the voting system, by voting desk. What that means that if you participated in a citizen scrutiny a few hours before, and you know the results of the elections in that particular table where you voted, you will see in the website of the CNE the same result. That's what should happen, and that's what's happened most of the time. So it's almost impossible to trick a system like that, and that's what I wanted to highlight this thing, because sometimes people don't talk too much about that. And now I'm gonna jump to these 21 of November elections, and I wanted to highlight a few important facts. I mean, 3,082 posts are at stake at these elections. I'm talking about 23 governors, 335 mayors, 253 state legislators, and 2,471 city councilors. So those are the posts that are going to be elected in almost a month. And we are talking that for those 3,000 something posts, we have right now, according to information from the CNE, 70,244 candidates. And according to something that Diosdado Cabello, one of the leaders of the Chavismo, something that he said a few days ago, 86% of of those candidates are from anti-Chavismo, and only 14% of those candidates are Chavistas. That's an important number to give you an idea on how undemocratic we are. I'm just joking. And the electoral roll, according to the last update that the CNA provided, is around 21 million Venezuelans. I mean, that means that 21 million Venezuelans are going to vote in the 21st of November elections. And I put here the list of candidates by jurisdiction. Right now, any Venezuelan, if I put the URL in this in the slideshow, so you will be able to click there later. But yesterday, the CNE announced that every Venezuelan will have the chance to look because it's very complex, because this election is by jurisdiction. If you are in a certain state, you won't be able to vote for the governor of another state. And if you planning to, I mean, the jurisdiction is very important for this kind of elections. So you have like different offers depending on where you live. So if you click in that last element that I put there, list of candidates by jurisdiction, you will go to the CNE website and you will have the names on each and every one of the candidates by each party in order for you to know who are you voting for. And I believe that's very important because sometimes there's no transparency about, you know, who are you voting for and what are the names, because in these kinds of elections, you also have the problem of that you have like the, you have the chance of voting by names and also of voting by lists. And it kind of make it a little bit more complicated. And that will happen in the cases of state legislators, I believe, and in the cases of city councilors. That, I mean, those two options. We have also international observation, and pay attention that I don't use international companions here because the CNE allowed changes in the regulations just to please the guys from the right wing and the guys in the European Union and the US to allow, just for this election, the participation of the European Union and the Carter Center and the United Nations. So for these elections, according to the information that is available right now, CILAG, which is a traditional observer and companion for Venezuelan elections, is going to be present, the European Union, the Carter Center, and the United Nations, not exactly as electoral observers, but with a panel of experts that is going to participate. I'm talking in this case about the United Nations. So that's another element that is going to provide, if everything happens according to the book, is going to provide more transparency to the electoral process. But we know that sometimes these international observation missions are plagued with political bias and, you know, imperialist approach. So we are aware of that. But we are so confident. I mean, when I say we, I'm talking about Chavismo, that we are going to win in these elections, that we have given this kind of exceptions to allow the participation of these international organizations. So now I want to mention you something that is also spoken a lot, and people write a lot about it, about the electoral guarantees. I'm going to the free and fair elections, you know, trend that sometimes mainstream media try to push. I mean, electoral guarantees. The CNE, as I already mentioned, allowed for these elections international observers and not companions. The CNE also allowed the participation, even before they decided to go into the elections, it allowed the presence of the right-wing card in the ballot. At that moment, they didn't even announce that they were running for finally we're going to run in these elections. But the CNE, as a gesture towards these people from the right wing, the anti-Chavismo, they did that gesture to facilitate them to participate. The CN board was elected through an agreement within the National Assembly. And basically they put, I mean, the CNN board is formed by 5 rectors. 2 of them are hardcore right-wingers. And that shouldn't, I mean, some people don't like when you talk about those things, about something that have to be neutral, but the reality in Venezuela is complicated and it's very polarized. And even though they do not, I mean, the right-wingers, the anti-Chavismo, do not have ways of representation in the National Assembly to have that level of participation within the CNE, the National Assembly decide to give them 2 seats of hardcore right-wingers in the board, in the executive board of the CNE. Jail politicians released, pay attention that I'm not talking about políticos presos, like political prisoners, which is the word that is used. I'm talking about people from the right wing, anti-Chavismo, that happens to be politicians sometimes, that are in jail because most of the time, because they have been trying to subvert or to promote coup d'etats or assassination attempts or things like that. And disregarding that fact, the CNA and the government have allowed the release, not some that haven't happened at least in recent weeks, but at the beginning of this year that happened, and the government released an important number of what they call political prisoners and that I call jail politicians. So that's just to give you an idea of the things that has been done by the Venezuelan state to facilitate the participation of the anti-Chavismo, of the opposition. Another very important element in this, and please guys, let me know if I'm running out of time or something, because I'm like inspired here. Wow, wait, give me a second. I just want to check the, okay. Now I'm gonna try to speed up a little bit and talk about the primaries. PSUV primaries are very important to understand the results that are gonna happen in the 21st of November. It was a primary elections in 2 stages. The first stage was decided by the UHS, which are the smallest electoral units from the PSUV, which is the government party. At that level, all Chavistas enrolled in the PSUV and participating in this Unidad de Batalla Bolívar Chávez, that's what UHS means. They decided, they cleared a list of possible candidates of Chavismo to the second stage in the primaries. That second stage was decided, I mean, was an election, a primary election, but was open. I mean, it allowed the participation not only of members of the PSUV, but also of any Venezuelan enrolled in the electoral roll. And the CNE did that. I mean, the PSUV, I mean, did that because they wanted to make it more, I mean, they want their candidates to be as much supported by the grassroots organization as possible. And I believe that that happened. I'm not a member of the PSUV, and I went to vote in those elections. And in doing that, I felt like more like committed. I don't know how to explain it, but I felt more like involved in the process, and that's very important, in my opinion. In that second level, I mean, in that second stage of the primaries, 3.5 million Venezuelans participate. That's something around like 12% or 14% of the electoral roll that I mentioned you. But 5.5 million Venezuelans attended the process. I mean, there was a problem. I mean, there's a difference between who participated and who attended, because there was a lack of voting machines in that primaries because some logistic issues, and a lot of people attend and the PSUV had their, you know, statistical people doing the work, counting people, and that's it. I mean, there was gender equality guarantee. 47,000 women were nominated, and only 43 men were nominated because the PSUV promoted gender equality in the nomination process. Top-ranked politicians got excluded, like Rafael Calles, the governor of Portuguesa, Edwin Rojas, the governor of Sucre, Henry Rangel Silva, the governor of Trujillo, Erika Faria, the mayor of Caracas, a high-ranked Chavista. All of them high-ranked Chavista. And they were, in the first days, they were rejected by the basis of the PSUV. They don't even have the chance to go to the second part of the process. And that says a lot about trying to select the right ones, trying to not to, promote the hierarchy or the nomenclatura of the PSUV and things like that. That is talked about a lot in mainstream media. 40% of the candidates are new youth cadre from the PSUV. That says also something very important about this process, which I believe strengthens PSUV chances of a victory in these elections. What happened from the other side? I mean, in the Chavismo, absolutely the contrary. I mean, alacranes is something that the right-wingers, hardcore anti-Chavistas, call this first group of anti-Chavistas that break with Guaidó in January 2020. So that was the first split between right-wingers in Venezuela. And G4 is the hardcore group of parties that still support the crazy failed attempt of Guaidó and the US. Then we have this split or struggle between Enrique Capriles, which is from Primero Justicia, and the G4. Because Enrique Capriles was in favor, even from the last parliamentary elections, to participate in the elections. And that was another split within the G4. And right now, we have this struggle within the G4. That's what I put there, G4 versus G4, because it happens because of that. There's a lot of struggle right now between candidates of the G4 fighting to be the real candidates in certain jurisdictions. For example, in Miranda State, there are 2 candidates for the G4. I believe that in Caracas also that happened, and in several other places around the country, we have that problem, and that's added division to something that is already, very divided. Going to elections versus voting versus not going to elections is another issue that has affected the trust of the anti-Chavismo towards their political leaderships. And of course, corruption scandals, there are many, but the most recent one is that Monómeros gate that is happening around the Monómeros company that belonged to Venezuela and was kidnapped by the Colombian government with the help of Guaidó, and right now is in bankruptcy, when it was never a company that had a financial problem until Guaidó came and his crew and start destroying that company. And that's in the media here in Venezuela a lot. That's part of the political discussion right now in Venezuela. Isolated incidents, that's something that is important because a lot of progressive leftist friends of Venezuela sometimes do not have everything clear. And I'm talking about the Eduardo Saman case. I mean, Eduardo Saman is a very respectable anti-Chavista, a very respectable Chavista leader that announced that he was going to run again for second time as mayor of Caracas with the help of the Communist Party and APR, which is an alliance of so-called progressive parties with the PCV, the Venezuelan Communist Party. For reasons that are not very clear until today, no one has explained sufficiently clear why he was excluded. And many, including me, believe that that decision was unnecessary, at least with the lack of information that we have right now. But what the guys that support Eduardo Saman said, and what they posted online and in the media, that he was excluded because of something that is called condition number 8. He was excluded by the CNE under something that is called condition number 8, which means that he was rejected due to a Supreme Court decision or a Controller General Office decision. That's all the information that is available until now. We don't know exactly what really happened. I'm not in favor of that decision, but I try to do some extrapolations to make people understand a little bit better what happened there. Saman chances to win these elections were very small. And that's, I believe, is something that is important to highlight. He got only 6% of the votes in the last time he ran for mayor of Caracas, and he arrived in 4th place. So that's to give you, to put a real perspective around the Eduardo Saman case. And so I wrote there, being skeptical, one might believe that the PSUV pushed, this decision to avoid splitting of the Chavista vote, Maybe if Saman was there, and that's one theory, I'm just saying it because there might be other theories. But the reality is that the PSUV candidate for Caracas is winning all the polls. I mean, and allegedly she is going to be the winner of the mayor of the city in the city of Caracas. So that theory doesn't make too much sense, at least at this point. Actually, another theory that might be gaining some weight in recent days is, and I did that exercise a few days ago, just applying something what called oposición al absurdo en español. I don't know how to translate that into English, but it's like thinking the opposite in the most absurd and extreme way. So that's what I wrote in the last part of the slide, being skeptical, but in the opposite direction. One might believe also that right-wing forces within the CNE might have something to do with this decision. I mean, if you want to blame the PSUV for this decision, another option might be that you can blame the right-wingers, because within the CNE, we have a lot of right-wingers, especially staff people there. And we also have 2 important rectors taking decisions there. And that crazy theory ring in my head more clearly after 2 or 3 days ago, when I saw that Rafael Uzcategui, which is the head of the PPT, which is almost brother of the general secretary of the PCV, of the Communist Party, and they are together in what is called the APR alliance, that alleged left-wing alliance that I mentioned before. He met with Ecardi, which is the G4 candidate for Caracas. So it seems that there might be some negotiations between PCV, APR with G4, I'm talking right-wingers, in order to do something about the candidate of this guy, Ecardi, as mayor of Caracas. So who knows what happened? I believe that it's complicated to, to dedicate too much time to that. I believe that the decision is not a good one, but there might be a lot of things. If you ask me, I would love to hear from someone from the Supreme Court or the Comptroller General Office to make a more clear explanation about this particular case. But I wanted to highlight that because I believe that is important. And now I want to show you some figures very briefly. 55% of Venezuelans, and those are recent ones from Interlaces, which is a very respectable poll company firm. And I tried to look for information. This is, Interlaces is somehow connected to Chavismo, but it's one of the most respected even among right-wingers. And I tried to look for information from other right-wing electoral poll firms, and I did not find anything. So I'm showing you what I got. 55% of Venezuelans believe that Maduro should finish his term, and only 43% believe that he should be recalled in a possible scenario of a recall referendum in 2022, according to what our Constitution established. This is an important, another important number that I believe you need to have. If you, this is like an expression of the political party preference of Venezuelans. These are polls of September 29. Those are the most recent polls that I got. So 52% of Venezuelans do not support any political party. But the rest is divided by 35% that support PSUV and Gran Polo Patriótico, which is the alliance of other small parties that support PSUV. And only 13% support right-winger parties. Those ones that are in the lower level there. A lot of people say that there is a lot of depoliticization, especially intellectuals and people like that. They talk a lot about, in recent years about depoliticization. I'm not among those ones that believe that the Venezuelan population has been depoliticized. I believe that basically what is happening is that we have a tough economic situation caused by the sanctions that make people forget a little bit and reject somehow whatever have to do with political parties, because right now they are just struggling to survive, you know? So that's my personal opinion. Maybe I'm wrong. But I believe that it's important for you to have this perspective. This is another recent poll which says how Venezuelans define themselves politically. 36% of Venezuelans consider themselves Chavistas supporting Maduro or Chavistas not supporting Maduro. But they consider themselves Chavistas, 36% of Venezuelans, and only 11% of Venezuelans consider themselves anti-Chavistas or right-wingers, revolving around Guaido. And the 53% that I mentioned before, that are people that are not identifying themselves right now with political parties at all. This is another important slide there you can see which are the most rejected politicians in Venezuela. That's another, this is another poll from September this year. And you have in first place of rejection, Juan Guaido. And then you go to Julio Borges, Leopoldo López, Henry Ramos Alup, Enrique Capriles, Henry Falcón, María Corina Machado, and Lorenzo Mendoza, which is actually a businessman that owns Polar, which is one of the biggest companies here. He's actually not a politician. And I'm surprised that Maria Corina Machado is there, but because I'm sure that a lot of right-wingers do not like her. But anyway, she was almost there. And the last thing that I want to mention is that, and this is important, that 74% want to participate in the elections. And that's important because it says a lot about the turnout that we might see in these elections. And this is another one that says that if Venezuelans, the first one talks about if you are agree or not with the economic sanctions from the US. And the second one says if you believe that economic sanctions affects all Venezuelans or just affects the officials, the government officials. So as you can see, US sanctions, Canadian sanctions, and European sanctions are not helping the appreciation of those countries, at least among Venezuelans. And this is the last one about the most recent one about if you vote or not from Interlaces in these 21 of November elections. 52 say that they completely will vote and 11% that they probably will vote. And then the remnant is people that are not going to vote or they believe that they are not going to vote. And this is something from Últimas Noticias, but that is very similar to the last slide, to the last numbers. In this poll from Últimas Noticias, 86%, according to this online poll, say that are going to vote. And amongst those that are going to vote, 96% are Chavistas. Sorry, I believe that I'm confusing my, yes. I mean, among Chavismo, 96% says that they will vote. Among opposition, 90% says that they will vote. And among Nini is something that we call the people that are not decided. 69% says that they are going to vote. So I believe that this is what I wanted to mention. Sorry if I extended myself a little bit. And I'm open to your questions.
All right. Okay, Jesús, thank you so much. It's obviously it sounds like it's a very complex system. Okay, and I think the complexity of the system is probably due to the fact that, in fact, you know, there is accountability. The system has to be proven, and it has to be acceptable, and all those requisites that an election requires. And the way I understand that Venezuela is doing it, it's very comprehensive. I think that's a very sort of thorough way that you have presented, you know, how the this election is going to take place, which it sounds to me like similar to what has happened in previous elections in Venezuela. Now, before we go on, I would like to remind people to ask questions in the Q&A part of the, at the bottom of the Zoom window, you will see a Q&A logo. You click on it, a small window will pop up, and there you can pose your question. Now, while we wait for that to happen, maybe one question, an immediate question that pops to mind is in relation to the peace dialogue that has been going on in Mexico, and that is now being suspended, and that of course creates all sorts of complications, because the right-wing opposition that you were referring to as well, they have shown a willingness to participate in the elections at this time. But of course, now with the dialogue in Mexico being suspended, of course, that creates some a revision of that decision that's probably going on right now. So in relation to that, maybe two questions. One is, what will there be an impact, in fact, on the elections, on the participation in the elections of November 21st? And if so, you know, how? And I think a related question to that is, what would be in that case the expected turnout of votes, you know, counter to what you have just explained based on the survey? Maybe you have an insight into that. You're muted.
Sorry about that. Nice questions, I was saying. And basically, I believe, I mean, it's important to highlight that all these electoral arrangements and rearrangements has been happening around the idea of, around the process of that we call Mexico talks. So the Mexico talks are important, but from what I hear, and what I've read, in this particular situation that we are facing right now, that the government decided a few days ago because of the kidnapping of Alex Saab to stop sending the delegation to Mexico for this third round of negotiations. My impressions are that that won't affect too much the political, the decision of right-wing political parties in participating and not participating. Actually, they are talking a lot in recent days here in Venezuela, in radio talks, in writings here and there, that most analysts say that they believe that the Mexico talks are not going to be resumed until January. That's what, especially the right-wing ones. So that gives me a sense that they were already prepared to that scenario, And of course, they cannot permit themselves the luxury of not going to the elections, because that is already a mess for them. I mean, this whole situation that I described in the slideshow represents a big mess for them, and deciding to not going for these elections using any excuse will signify that they are going to be worried for good by their supporters. I'm talking about their right wing, the right wing base that they still have in Venezuela. So they are fighting and they are participating in this election, not because they are Democrats, but because they really, in my opinion, see that if they don't do that, they will lose any chance of winning any elections ever, at least in recent years. You know what I mean? So because of that, I believe that going to the second question, that won't affect too much the turnout for the elections because of what I told you. But who knows? Who knows? I mean, the whole scenario is very complicated always in Venezuelan elections. We always have the possibility that these right-wing parties decide at the last minute not to participate. That's a risk that have happened before, and we have to be prepared for that. We have also the complications that we might have a bias with political agendas, international observation agencies that might try to provoke some political disruptions. I don't see that very clear as a real possibility, but that have happened before. So we have to be prepared for that. And also we have the other scenario, related to the opposition parties rejecting or saying again that there was a fraud and that they don't recognize the results and they will call their people to the street. But I believe that even in that scenario, they don't have too much people that are going to join them in the streets. That's my opinion.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm wrong or too optimistic.
We'll find out. Well, thanks, Jesús. Now there's another question actually that popped up in the, and it's in relation to the communes. I guess I have not heard of any reference specific, especially within the survey that you mentioned. But I think how do you see the commune's electoral representation now? I mean, in these elections, or maybe even in the future, will the communes have a special representation, special candidates maybe as such as communes, or just, they will be individual citizens who will just vote like anybody else?
Yes, it's a nice question because, especially because I initially saw when you asked about the communes, how I saw immediately that you wanted to know about the status of the communal movement in Venezuela, which is what usually people abroad ask. But now I know that you are going towards another direction that is important. But I believe that it's important to highlight that the communes are there.
Yeah.
That they as all of us in Venezuela has been heavily affected by the economic situation, by the US sanctions, and the communes has been impacted by that. Even the political decisions taken by the state toward the communes has been impacted. Actually, today I was listening to President Maduro talking about that particular issue, like a couple of hours ago. And he was recalling the importance of keep pushing towards the communes. And he mentioned that he understands that the economic situation and all the troubles that we're facing right now has been diverting us from, keep building that project. But he highlighted that it is very important, that it's vital for the revolution to keep pushing towards the creation of a communal, system in Venezuela. And he talks about the law of communal cities, which is something that was being discussed in the National Assembly a few months ago, but I haven't heard too much lately about that. And there is also the law for the communal Congress, I believe that is the name of that law. And he mentioned that we need to revitalize that debate and push towards the approval of those laws. I believe that from there, from the approval of the communal, the communal city law and the communal Congress law, we might have, like in some years from now, I don't say that it's going to happen very fast. We might have certain levels of organization within the communes, but I believe, according to what I've read from the communal city law and the Congress or the communal Congress or assembly, that within the communal system, they already have their own voting and selection structure that allows them to be democratic, because the commune in its essence is a very democratic process in which people from certain areas decide to organize themselves to solve their problems, and they choose certain levels of representation as speakers. And according to what I remember that I read from the law of communal cities, I saw that they had also within the law certain provisions for selection, elections, and things like that. So maybe that's my conclusion after reading a few, not a few, but I read it because we translated the whole law and published it in Orinoco Tribune a few months ago, because we wanted people outside Venezuela to have that information at hand. So we did a job because it was a long law, and we translated it trying to be as accurate as possible. So we read it and we reread it, just trying to make it to have the best translation possible. So that's my impression after reading that law. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there will be at some point, as you mentioned, elections for communes and things like that. But I believe that those democratic processes are already embedded in the concept of commune. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Okay.
But maybe I'm wrong. Again, I'm not an expert. I'm just a person that happens to have read the law recently.
You're on the ground, you know more than us. Yeah. Yes. Well, there's another question that's sort of related, and somehow here in Canada, the Indigenous people issue is very, very big. It's very important. It's very relevant. And in Canada, we try to always be in support of the struggle of Indigenous people. Now, my understanding, of course, I follow what's happening in Venezuela as well, is that the Indigenous population in Venezuela is very much protected, so to speak, or he has a legitimate representation, really, within the Constitution. So now again, how do the indigenous population participate or is represented and whatnot, both in elections as such, as having delegates, having candidates, I should say, in the elections, and therefore be also represented in the National Assembly and so on at this time?
Yes, I'm not an expert either in that area, but I know that, for example, Indigenous people have representation a constitutional representation and proportional representation whenever we have elections for the parliament, for the National Assembly, as we had a few months ago. So a percentage of the whole electoral, results should be given to indigenous political organizations or indigenous organizations. And we actually have several deputies from our National Assembly that has been elected like that. In the case of these kind of elections that are regional, I'm not sure how it works. You know what I mean? But I hear, and I believe that I have read also that there are indigenous political organizations participating in these elections. That makes me believe that, for example, in the case of the state legislatures or the community or the city councils, they might have a chance to have some sort of, proportional representation or something like that. But I'm just guessing. Okay, I'm not pretty sure about that. What I'm sure is that I have read from documents from the CNE, from our electoral authority, that there are indigenous organizations participating in this 21 of November elections. But I don't want to talk too much because I'm not 100% sure, about the details. Yeah. But in general terms, if you ask me, as you say, I believe that we have been way more respectful towards indigenous peoples that what happened in the North, like in the US or in Canada. Disregarding the fact that before Chavismo, there were also a lot of atrocities that happened by, the previous political parties towards the indigenous community. And not only in recent decades, but I'm talking about that during the colonial times, the conquistadores, in the case of Venezuela, they exterminated a big chunk of the indigenous population here. And we have a small spots here and there of indigenous, areas, indigenous populations. Most of them in the border between Venezuela and Colombia, Venezuela and Brazil, and certain areas within, dispersed areas within the countryside of Venezuela. Yeah. But they have been recognized constitutionally, and I believe that they have received more attention than never before, if you ask me.
Yeah, well, I think some of that information, I think we also have. In fact, we know that, for instance, for the National Assembly, in that election, there were a certain number of seats that were in fact assigned or reserved, so to speak, for the indigenous people representation. Obviously, that is something that in a way suggests that in the electoral process, something has to be in fact designed in such a way so that can be done. And again, as you mentioned, it's because of a constitutional right that the indigenous people have in Venezuela.
Let me add something that just you make me remember. In those electoral process related to indigenous populations, indigenous peoples, their ways are respected. You know what I mean? Their traditions and the values and the ways they choose their authorities historically are somehow translated by the electoral, by the CNE, in order to get the most real representation, not from the perspective of the white men from the city, but from their own, traditions and roots and rules. So those processes that are usually take more time whenever you have Venezuelan elections like the ones that we had in, last December here in Venezuela, in National Assembly, for example, we had that issue that we have to wait like one more week for the electoral process in the indigenous community to end, because it's completely different. Yes, and it respects a lot the traditions and the ways and forms of the communities.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, thanks, Jesus. Now, we have a comment or question by our dear friend Luis Acuña. For those who don't know, Luis Acuña was the chargé d'affaires for Venezuela in Canada, in Ottawa, and he was a virtual ambassador. So I think he's attending this webinar, and of course we greet him very much. But he makes this observation, and maybe you want to comment on that. And he says that the election on November 21st are not political compromise. They are a constitutional mandate. The Alex Saab kidnapping will be fought by Venezuela until we succeed. The elections of November 21st will not be affected by this issue. The election will go on no matter what. The Mexico talks will go as far as the parts involved decide. The elections on November 21st will not be affected by the talks. The elections will go on no matter what, again. So anyway, I don't know if you will have a comment on that, but that seems to be quite a statement, a strong statement.
I agree with that. I believe that is close to what I said. But of course, we always have to take a look to disregarding whatever statement one might said to the political tradition of our right wingers here in Venezuela, you know, and their ways to try to sabotage everything whenever where the reality is not pushing towards them. But that doesn't mean, of course, that the elections are going to be canceled or something like that. But of course, they will try. They could try. I don't see it as a possibility right now, but they could try to sabotage elections the ways that I mentioned you before.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks again. Now, unfortunately, we are over time already, about 10 minutes over time. So I'm afraid we will have to end this webinar. Before we end, Jesús, I would like to ask you any closing remarks for our audience that you would like to make.
Yes. First, I want to thank you again for the invitation. I love to participate in these kind of activities because a lot of people outside Venezuela do not have clear information about what really happened here. And that's one of the nature of the work that we do in Orinoco Tribune. And I also wanted to let you know that we follow closely. A lot of people believe that we in Venezuela live like close or encapsulated from the external world. And part of the work that we do in Orinoco Tribune, when we publish information of events happening around the world, is to portray the atrocities of the system, but also to show the world that we in Venezuela are very aware of what happened all over the world, and in that sense that we sympathize with the cause of the indigenous movement in Canada, for example, or with the cause of those affected by mostly indigenous people by the pipelines and all those movements in Canada. That what I want to say is that we are in solidarity with those movements in Canada of people trying to fight the system. That is very complicated, but at least there is people trying to do that and fight the racism embedded in the settled colonialist mentality. So and all these scandals of indigenous kids killed in schools in Canada is something very atrocious, and we are very aware of those things, and we are always in solidarity with the indigenous movements, anti-racist and the environmentalist organizations in Canada. And if you ask me, just to finish, I believe, just to give a sense of what in my opinion is going to be, is on the elections, I believe that we are going to have a very clear victory in most of the posts that are going to be challenged in the elections. I'm talking about Chavismo. I believe that Chavismo is going to result victorious in this next challenge for the reasons that I already mentioned to you, but also because Chavismo is very rooted within Venezuelans. Disregarding whatever you said, or whatever you hear in mainstream media, Chavismo is something that goes beyond a lot of things. So I'm optimistic about the results of these elections, if you ask me.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you. Well, as we end this webinar, yeah, I would like to thank again, in fact, our indigenous people. I would like to thank again also all the organizers of this event, the endorsers, and also especially Aidan Jonah, the editor of our dear media, the Canada Files. And of course, Jesús, to you, a big abrazo, compatriota. And I really appreciate your participation and your information.
Listen, I'm putting, sorry to interrupt you, I'm putting the link to the slideshow in the chat.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks.
Yes.
And also, yeah, we continue our support for the Orinoco Tribune, which is very essential to our solidarity work about Venezuela and for Venezuela. And thanks to all the participants who have been so kind to join in. My final thanks to the Venezuelan people who struggle daily to fulfill Chavez's vision of socialism for all of us. That is our vision as well. It is our goal. We continue our struggle towards socialism, and we believe that we share that with Venezuela and other struggling nations in the world. So thanks again to everyone, and venceremos.
Yes, we will. Un abrazo. Bye bye, compa.